Police don't like to admit this, but in this case, they made a decision so final, so confident, that it shut down every other possibility, and that decision turned out to be wrong. They declared a missing teenage girl dead. No body, no crime scene, no forensic proof. And years later, they had to face a reality that embarrassed an entire investigation. Natasha Ryan was alive. That single fact doesn't just challenge this case, it challenges how police decide when a search is over, when hope is abandoned, and when a story becomes official without being true. Because once authorities tell the public someone is dead, everything changes. Searches slow, questions stop, and alternative explanations quietly disappear. So the real question isn't where Natasha Ryan was. The real question is this: how did police convince themselves she was dead when they had no proof? Before we get into the decisions that led to that conclusion, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Not for hype, but because this is exactly the kind of case where uncomfortable details get brushed aside and accountability quietly fades away. August 31st, 1998. The last day of winter in Rockhampton, Australia. A Monday morning that looked like any other. Natasha Ryan, 14 years old, climbed into her mother's car for the drive to school. Jenny Ryan said goodbye to her daughter at the school gates, a routine they'd done 100 times before. Natasha got out of the car, and then she was gone. Not dramatically, not violently, not in a way anyone noticed at the time. She simply vanished. At first, her parents weren't surprised because Natasha wasn't an easy kid. She'd been suspended from school. She'd experimented with drugs. She'd cut her own wrists once. She was seeing a counselor for psychological issues. And this wasn't even the first time she'd disappeared. A few months earlier, Natasha had run away to be with her boyfriend, Scott Black, a man 8 years older than her. Police had found them after a few days, brought her home, and everyone assumed that was the end of it. So when Natasha didn't come home on August 31st, her parents thought the same thing had happened again. She'd run off with Scott. She'd turn up in a few days. It would all blow over. But when police contacted Scott Black, he said something that changed everything. He hadn't seen her. He hadn't heard from her. He had no idea where she was. That's when panic set in. Because if Natasha wasn't with Scott, then where was she? And if she hadn't run away on purpose, then what had happened to her? The investigation began immediately. Search parties, media appeals, public pleas from her family. But underneath all of that, something else was happening. Police were already forming a theory. And that theory didn't involve finding Natasha alive. Now let's be very clear about what this case is and what it isn't. This isn't a mystery about someone vanishing without explanation. This isn't a ghost story. And this isn't a case where police simply did their best. This is a case where authorities made a definitive call without definitive proof, doubled down on it, and built an entire investigation and public narrative around an assumption. So the question Australians should be asking isn't, where was Natasha Ryan? It's this: how did police convince themselves she was dead when she wasn't? Natasha Ryan was just 14 years old, a teenager from a working-class Queensland town with a troubled home life. Her parents were separating. She was struggling at school. She had a history of rebellion and self-harm. On paper, she looked like a runaway. But almost immediately, police began treating the case as something far more serious. There was no body, no confirmed crime scene, no forensic evidence of death. Yet very early on, the investigation drifted toward a conclusion that would shape everything that followed. Police became convinced Natasha had been murdered. And once that belief took hold, every decision after that flowed from it. Searches were framed around recovery, not rescue. Witness statements were filtered through a single lens. Alternative explanations slowly faded into the background. And here's where the first red flag appears. When police declare someone deceased without physical proof, they are supposed to rely on overwhelming circumstantial evidence. Not gut feeling, not pressure, not probability. So what was that evidence? What exactly justified closing the door on the possibility that Natasha was alive? That's the uncomfortable question this case still hasn't answered. In the months after her disappearance, Rockhampton was flooded with rumours, sightings, whispers, claims from people who believed they had seen Natasha in town, in nearby suburbs, even further afield. Some of those reports were dismissed quickly. Others weren't followed up with the urgency you'd expect in a missing child case. Why? Because once investigators start believing they already know the ending, new information becomes inconvenient. Ask yourself this: if police truly believed a 14-year-old girl might still be alive, would they ignore potential sightings so easily? Or does that only make sense once the investigation has quietly shifted from find her to confirm what we think happened? As time passed, the narrative hardened. Police publicly stated they believed Natasha Ryan was dead. That declaration didn't come with forensic proof, it came with confidence. And confidence in cases like this can be dangerous. Because when authorities say someone is dead, the public listens. Media stops asking certain questions. Resources begin to dry up, and the case enters a different category entirely: a solved disappearance, even without a body. But here's where this case starts to unravel. Despite being officially considered deceased, Natasha Ryan kept appearing. Not on CCTV, not in databases, but in the accounts of ordinary people who said repeatedly that they had seen her. Neighbours, locals, people with no incentive to lie. Were all of them mistaken? Or was something else happening, something police didn't want to confront? Let's pause here and be honest. Police handle thousands of missing persons cases. They know false sightings happen. They know memory is unreliable. They know people want to help. But they also know patterns. And in this case, the pattern was strange. Sightings didn't stop. They didn't taper off naturally. They didn't all come from one unreliable source. They continued quietly in the background, while the official investigation moved in the opposite direction. So ask yourself, at what point does dismissing sightings become negligence? And who decides that point? What makes this even more disturbing is what police later admitted. Years after Natasha Ryan was declared dead, it became clear she had been alive for a significant period of time after her disappearance. Not just briefly, not just hiding for days or weeks. She had been living, largely undetected, in plain sight. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable part of this case. This wasn't a failure of technology. This wasn't a lack of resources. This wasn't the result of a single missed lead. This was a failure of assumption. Police assumed they knew what had happened and built everything around that belief. Once that happens, investigations don't just slow down, they become blind. Think about the implications of that. If Natasha Ryan could remain alive while police were actively investigating her murder, what does that say about how conclusions were reached? What does it say about how alternative explanations were treated? And what does it say about other cases where police make similar declarations without bodies, without forensic certainty? Because this isn't just about one teenager in Rockhampton. This is about a system that, once it commits to a story, struggles to reverse course, even when facts start pushing back. Now, some people defend the police response by saying this: well, they had to make a call. They couldn't keep the case open forever. That sounds reasonable, until you remember we're talking about a missing child. No body, no confirmed homicide, no conclusive evidence of death. So why rush to closure? Was it pressure from the media? Pressure from the community? Pressure to deliver answers where none existed? Or was it something simpler? The discomfort of admitting uncertainty. Because uncertainty is hard, especially in high-profile cases, especially when the public wants closure. But closure without truth isn't closure at all. It's convenience. And this case shows exactly what happens when convenience wins. As the years passed, Natasha Ryan's case faded from the headlines. She became another name on a long list, another tragic story that, according to authorities, had already ended. Her family had given up hope. Her mother, Jenny, publicly said she didn't believe Natasha would let her suffer if she was still out there alive. The investigation moved on. The public moved on. The media moved on, except it hadn't ended. When the truth eventually emerged, it didn't just shock the public. It exposed something far more damaging. It showed that an entire investigation, public statements, media reporting, and community understanding had been built on a foundation that simply wasn't solid. So here's the question that should bother every Australian. If police can be this wrong in a case like this, how many other investigations are resting on assumptions instead of evidence? How many other missing persons have been quietly written off? And how often does confidence replace caution? Because what happened here wasn't just a mistake, it was a lesson about tunnel, vision, about narrative momentum, about how hard it is for institutions to admit they might be wrong. And we're only just getting started. In the next episode, we're going to break down the timeline itself, the contradictions, the ignored signals, and the moments where this case could have taken a very different path. Because once you see how the timeline was handled, it becomes impossible to believe this was just bad luck. If you've got thoughts on this case, especially if you remember it happening, I want to hear them. Do you think police moved too quickly to a conclusion? Or do you think declaring her dead was inevitable given the circumstances? Subscribe if you want more investigations that don't stop at the official version. All right, mate, tell me your thoughts below, and I'll see you in the next one.